Most people think trauma means something extreme. So when most people hear the word trauma, they're thinking things like war, sexual abuse, physical abuse, a near-death experience, PTSD maybe. And look, those things are absolutely traumatic. But I think our definition of trauma is so limited that millions of people are walking around every day deeply wounded without ever even realizing it. Because some trauma doesn't actually come from what happened to you. It comes from what never happened for you. I'm talking about things like no emotional safety in your environment, no attunement or real understanding, no space to express real emotion without consequences, no feeling of being deeply seen for who you actually were. And because those wounds are invisible, we have a tendency to normalize them. We call them our personality. We call them independence or easygoing, maturity. And often, this is what we call coping. But coping and healing are not the same thing. In fact, some of the behaviors we praise the most in our society are actually just adaptations to the very trauma I'm talking about. Overworking, people-pleasing, never needing help, avoiding conflict, numbing emotionally, hyper-independence. These are coping mechanisms that we call our personality. And the scariest part is that most people never question them because they're simply adaptations that helped us to survive. So in this video, I want to completely reframe the way we think about trauma, stress, coping, and healing. Because if you don't understand the ways you've adapted in order to survive, you are going to spend your entire life protecting wounds that you never even realized you had. Now, I think one of the biggest problems in modern conversations around trauma is that we've created this hierarchy of suffering. Like trauma only counts if it is catastrophic enough. So people hear the word trauma and immediately think, well, I wasn't abused. My parents did the best that they could. I know that they loved me because I had a roof over my head, food on the table. Other people definitely had it worse. And because of that, people dismiss the profound impact that relational stress and emotional deprivation can have on a human being, especially on a developing child. You see, trauma is not just what happened to you. It is what happened inside of you as a result of experiences you were unable to process, integrate, or emotionally resolve. That means that trauma can absolutely come from not being loved unconditionally, feeling emotionally alone in your family, not feeling safe to express real emotion, being valued for achievement instead of authenticity, growing up in an emotionally unpredictable environment, never being fully truly seen, never feeling like you belonged anywhere. I think one of the most overlooked and detrimental forms of trauma in our culture has everything to do with emotional absence. So what was missing in your environment? Here's why. Because human beings are relational creatures. We need emotional attunement, presence, safety, connection, closeness with others, understanding. When those things are repeatedly absent in our environment, our nervous system learns to adapt. But here's the part that's so difficult to wrap your head around, because it's incredibly hard to recognize trauma caused by something that wasn't there. Because how do you miss something you've never experienced? So if you grew up in a house where emotional connection was absent, you were never thinking to yourself, something is missing here. No. Instead, you think, this must be what relationships feel like. And children don't just miraculously stop needing connection when it's unavailable. They just stop expecting it. And that adaptation can look so normal and so functional that people spend decades believing that their loneliness is simply their personality, or maybe even their preference, instead of what it really is, a byproduct of unresolved relational pain. And this brings me to the part of the conversation I think is even more important, and that is coping. Because even though trauma is incredibly common, coping is even more common. Most people are not healed, they're simply adapted. And there is a huge difference there. The dictionary defines coping as dealing effectively with something difficult. But dealing with something is not the same as healing from it. And this is where I disagree with so much of the mainstream self-help and even many of the psychological therapy approaches, because we have unintentionally created a culture that teaches people to tolerate unhealthy lives rather than teaching them how to transform them. Now, before anyone misunderstands me, I am not saying that all coping strategies are bad. Sometimes coping is necessary. We as human beings are incredibly adaptive. That's part of our brilliance. But the problem is that coping mechanisms actually work. That is why people will defend them tooth and nail. People-pleasing works. Avoidance works. Emotionally shutting down, absolutely works. Overachievement, perfectionism, all of these things work. They actually help us survive our environments that feel emotionally unsafe. But survival strategies become dangerous when they outlive the environments that created them. I think this is where so many people get stuck, because the adaptation eventually literally becomes your identity. And that's where fragmentation begins. Because when certain emotions, needs, and parts of yourselves threaten connection and safety, you actually learn to split away from them. After years and years of doing this, so many people become so adapted to just performing different versions of themselves that they truly lose touch with who they really are underneath those survival coping mechanisms. I actually made an entire video on this concept of fragmentation because a lot of people don't realize that trauma doesn't just wound us emotionally. It actually splits us into psychologically fragmented parts, making it so difficult to know which parts of ourselves are authentic and which parts are just there for our protection. It's called Fragmentation, the Hidden Cost of Trauma, and I will link it in the description. But here's the thing. When an adaptation becomes our identity, it often turns into a form of learned helplessness, because we stop seeing ourselves as people capable of changing our environment and instead see ourselves as people whose job it is to just endlessly adapt. Over time, those survival strategies or coping mechanisms stop feeling like choices, and they start feeling like personality traits. So it is rare that a person stops and asks, what is it that I can change? And we become blinded to what is actually in our control to change. Instead, we ask ourselves, how do I learn how to tolerate this? And that mindset keeps people emotionally stuck well after the original environment is gone. People say things like, I'm just independent, or I'm low maintenance. I just don't need very much from people. Or I hate conflict. I'm just ambitious. or anxious. Okay, maybe. And also maybe those are just very intelligent adaptations that your nervous system developed in order to preserve the connection and reduce your emotional pain. You guys, this is such an important conversation for me because there was a period in my life where I genuinely thought I was emotionally healthy because I was functioning. I was productive and responsible and reflective even. But underneath it all, I was incredibly miserable and alone and could not wrap my head around why. I had learned to adapt so much to my environment that I couldn't even recognize the dysfunction in my life. And most of you know what I'm talking about because you've experienced it too. Maybe you've avoided conflict or endlessly tried to be understood by people who had no real capacity to understand you. Or maybe you've adapted by managing other people's emotional states. Or maybe you've worked harder or done more hoping to achieve some kind of purpose in your life. Or maybe you're suppressing parts of yourself in order to maintain connection to others. But here's the problem. If nothing catastrophic actually has happened to us, no big traumatic events in your life, we don't think that any of this qualifies as trauma. So we assume that our pain must mean something is wrong with us. But what happens in emotionally disconnected environments is so much quieter and far more difficult to recognize. So you might experience things like feeling chronically alone, even when you're surrounded by people, or emotionally disconnected from yourself, like struggling because nobody really knows the real you, or feeling guilty for having needs or uncomfortable expressing your emotions. Maybe you feel emotionally numb or flat or hyper aware of other people's moods. Or maybe you feel responsible for maintaining harmony in every environment you find yourself in. Maybe you're afraid of being too much, or maybe you're deeply exhausted from performing different versions of yourself based on who you're around. Maybe you're unable to relax in relationships, or maybe you feel like love is something that has to be earned, or connection never quite felt secure or fulfilling. And then because there's no obvious catastrophe, you're internalizing those feelings as personal deficits rather than adaptations. And then you spend years wondering what's wrong with you, questioning why you can't just be happy. You ask yourself, why do I feel so empty and lonely even though I know people love me? Why do relationships always feel so hard? But so many times the issue is not that something is wrong with you. It is that you had to adapt to environments where emotional connection, safety, authenticity, or attunement were inconsistent, absent, or conditional. When those needs go unmet long enough, loneliness stops feeling like an emotion and starts feeling like your identity. And honestly, I think this is why so many high-functioning people struggle in silence, because society rewards functional trauma. If your pain makes you productive, agreeable, hardworking, emotionally self-sacrificing, or successful, people are going to praise you for it. And it is so messed up because functioning is not the same thing as thriving. A person can look completely fine on the outside while living in survival mode on the inside. And I think many people don't even realize how much of their personality is actually built around adaptation until the relationships in their lives force them to confront it. Because this is the beauty of relationships. They will absolutely expose your coping. Your relationships will expose avoidance, fear, hypervigilance, emotional shutdown, people-pleasing, the inability to ask for what it is you need, your fear of abandonment, fear of disappointing people, fear of conflict. Your relationships reveal the strategies that we have created to survive emotionally unsafe environments. And this absolutely matters because trauma doesn't just affect our emotions. It also affects our perception, so how we perceive the world, the people around us. It affects how we identify and the meaning we make of ourselves, because when painful experiences go unresolved, we unconsciously organize our lives around avoiding those painful feelings again. And let me tell you, this will absolutely wreak havoc on your life because it changes who you trust, the people you choose, what you tolerate, what feels normal, what feels safe, what feels threatening. So an example of this is if speaking honestly felt unsafe in your childhood, you are probably going to enter adulthood and become avoidant of conflict. Or if love felt inconsistent, chaos is going to feel chemically attractive as an adult. Or if your emotional needs were dismissed as a child, you might struggle to even recognize your own needs. And definitely struggle to communicate them if you can't even recognize them. These adaptations can become so normal that people genuinely believe this is just who I am. But so many times, it is not actually who you are. It is who you became because you had to cope and adapt to unsafe environments. Now, the biggest problem is that when we confuse survival strategies with our identity, we don't ever question whether change is actually a possibility for us. This is the learned helplessness that I spoke of earlier. And this is why I believe that all healing begins with awareness, because the moment you can recognize an adaptation that you made in your childhood, you actually gain the ability to consciously choose something different. One of the saddest realities about trauma is that so many people never realize they were wounded because their adaptations looked so functional externally. When survival strategies become your identity, healing can actually feel threatening because you start to question who you actually are without the coping, who you actually are without constantly managing everyone else, without overperforming, without hiding, without emotionally shrinking yourself in order to maintain connection. Healing is not about blaming your parents. It is also not about pathologizing every difficult experience or turning yourself into a victim. Healing is about becoming conscious. And once you see the adaptations that you made to cope with an environment that you couldn't change, you finally have the power to decide whether it's still serving you. Healing is not about becoming a different person. It is about becoming the person you would have been if survival had never become your primary focus. And this is the conversation that way more people need to be having.